They said the law kept the stars from tearing themselves apart, but laws only work until someone decides a life is worth more than order. The wind scraped across the glass dunes in long, whispering waves, dragging fine metallic dust against the hull of Ethan Cole's transport like sandpaper on steel, the temperature gauge blinking a steady -42 degrees Fahrenheit as the old ship's systems groaned under the strain, warning lights pulsing amber across the console in a tired rhythm he had long since learned to ignore, because out here warnings didn't mean danger, they meant survival had already started costing more than expected. Ethan leaned back in his seat, one hand resting on the manual throttle, the other wrapped around a dented thermal mug that had long since gone cold, his reflection faint in the cracked display screen, pale skin drawn tight from too many long runs and not enough sleep, light brown hair flattened under a worn cap, eyes scanning the horizon not out of habit but instinct, because something about this sector felt wrong in a way his instruments couldn't measure, a silence too clean, too deliberate. The cargo hold behind him rattled softly as the ship adjusted to a crosswind, the stabilizers whining, and for a moment he considered turning back, logging the route as unstable, filing the report, collecting a smaller paycheck and moving on, but that wasn't how he worked, never had been, and it wasn't why he was still out here when better pilots had retired planetside years ago. A flicker crossed the lower edge of his scanner, brief, almost lost in the static, a signal too weak to classify, and Ethan's fingers tightened slightly on the controls as he leaned forward, tapping the display, isolating the anomaly, watching as it pulsed once, then again, not random, not environmental, something artificial, something small. That's not supposed to be there, he muttered, voice low, more to the ship than himself, and he adjusted course by 2 degrees, engines shifting with a low hum as the transport angled toward the signal source, the wind intensifying as if in protest, dragging streaks of pale dust across the viewport. As he descended, the landscape resolved into fractured glass planes and jagged mineral outcroppings, the remains of something ancient and violent, and there, barely visible between two broken spires, stood a thin column of dull black metal, half buried, its surface etched with symbols he didn't need a translator to understand, the kind of markings that didn't warn, they condemned. Ethan set the ship down 100 yards out, the landing gear biting into the brittle surface with a sharp crack, and for a second he just sat there, listening to the engine wind down, the silence that followed pressing in from all sides, heavier than before, like the world itself was holding its breath. He grabbed his jacket, shrugged it on, and stepped out into the cold, the air biting instantly at his face, each breath sharp and dry as he moved toward the column, boots crunching against crystallized ground, the wind tugging at his clothes, whispering around him in a language that sounded almost like warning. He saw it when he got closer, not the structure, but what it held, a small figure at its base, partially shielded by the metal frame, too still, too quiet, and something in his chest tightened before his mind could catch up, before logic could step in and list all the reasons to walk away, because logic had rules, and rules out here kept people alive, but they also decided who didn't get to be. The figure shifted, just slightly, enough to catch the dim light reflecting off the glass planes, and Ethan exhaled slowly, the sound lost to the wind as he took another step forward, already knowing, before he even saw her face, that whatever this was, it wasn't something he was going to leave behind. The closer Ethan stepped, the more the wind seemed to pull away from the structure, as if even the storm refused to touch it, leaving a hollow pocket of stillness that felt unnatural against the biting cold, his boots slowing as the markings along the column came into full view, sharp geometric symbols etched deep into the metal, each one pulsing faintly with a dim amber glow that synced with the weak signal he had tracked from orbit, a rhythm that was too deliberate to ignore and too ominous to dismiss, and then he saw the chain, not heavy, not crude, but precise, a narrow band of alloy anchored to the base of the column and extending to the small figure beside it, secured not with force but with intent, a design meant to hold something that was never expected to fight back. The child sat curled against the metal, knees drawn in, arms wrapped tight as if conserving the last of her warmth, her skin a pale shade of blue that caught the faint light like frosted glass, her hair thin and silver, drifting slightly with each shallow breath, and for a moment Ethan just stood there, the world narrowing to that single image, the cold forgotten, the warnings in his head going quiet one by one, because nothing about this looked like a threat, nothing about this looked like something that deserved to be left behind. He crouched slowly, careful, his gloved hand hovering just above the chain before he reached out, the metal colder than the air itself, sending a sharp sting through the fabric, and the moment his fingers made contact, the column reacted, a soft hum building beneath the surface as the amber symbols brightened, a line of text flashing across his wrist display in crisp, unforgiving clarity, unauthorized contact detected. Protected classification, forbidden genetic variant. Removal punishable by immediate termination. Ethan exhaled slowly, the breath fogging in front of him, his eyes flicking from the warning to the child and back again, weighing something that should not have needed weighing, because the law was clear, the consequences were absolute, and yet none of that changed what was right in front of him. The child stirred at the sound of his movement, her eyes opening just enough to reveal a deep violet glow beneath frost-laced lashes, sharp, aware despite her condition, and she did not cry out or reach for him, she only watched, silent, cautious, as if she had already learned what reaching out could cost. "Hey," Ethan said quietly, his voice softer than he expected, the word almost carried away by the still air, "I am not here to hurt you," and the translator in his suit hesitated for a fraction of a second before rendering the phrase into a tone the system believed she might understand, the sound slightly distorted, mechanical, but close enough to carry intent. Her gaze did not soften, but it did not turn away either, and that was enough. He shifted closer, lowering himself fully to one knee, his tools already in his hand before he made the decision conscious, because that was how it always happened, the choice forming somewhere deeper than thought, somewhere that did not calculate odds or consequences, only outcomes that he could live with. The chain's locking mechanism was embedded into the column, sleek and seamless, no obvious release, no simple override, just a thin seam where two materials met, and Ethan traced it with his fingers, feeling the faint vibration beneath the surface, the system active, alert, waiting. "Yeah," he murmured under his breath, more to himself than anything else, they really did not want anyone messing with this, and he glanced once more at the warning still blinking across his display, steady, patient, as if it knew he was reading it and expected him to listen. He did not. The first cut was not dramatic, just a quiet shift in pressure as his tool engaged, a focused beam designed for precision work, slicing into the seam with controlled heat, the metal resisting at first before giving way in a slow, glowing line, the hum from the column rising in response, louder now, more insistent, and a second message flashed across his display, sharper this time, violation escalated. Beacon activation in progress. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly as he continued, the beam steady, the cut widening, because he understood what that meant, understood that somewhere far beyond the horizon, something had just been alerted, something that would not ignore a signal like this, but he also understood something else, something simpler, something that did not need translation. The child was still watching him, her small hand shifting just enough to rest against the cold surface beside her, as if testing whether he was real or just another passing shadow, and Ethan met her gaze for a brief second, offering the only reassurance he could in that moment, not with words, not with promises, but with action, as the final section of the lock gave way with a soft click, the chain loosening in his hand. "You are not staying here," he said quietly, and this time the translator did not hesitate. The chain fell away with a soft metallic whisper, lighter than Ethan expected, as if it had never been meant to hold weight, only to mark ownership, and for a brief second nothing happened, no alarm screaming, no sudden movement in the sky, just the quiet hum of the column fading into a low, defeated pulse, like a system that had already accepted its failure. The child did not move immediately, her body still curled in the same guarded position, her eyes fixed on the broken restraint now resting in Ethan's hand, as though she did not trust the absence of it, as though freedom was something that required confirmation before it could be believed. Ethan set the chain down slowly, careful not to startle her, and reached out again, this time more deliberately, his hand stopping just short of her shoulder, giving her space to decide, because out here choice mattered more than speed, and forcing it would only make him another version of what had put her here in the first place. "You can stand," he said quietly, the translator smoothing his tone into something steady and neutral, not commanding, not pleading, just offering, and for a moment the wind shifted at the edge of the still zone, carrying a faint hiss across the glass planes as if the world itself was waiting to see what she would do. Her fingers loosened slightly against her arms, a small movement, barely noticeable, but enough to tell him she was listening, enough to tell him she understood more than the system likely expected her to, and then, slowly, she unfolded, her movements careful, deliberate, as if every motion had to be measured against an unseen cost, her feet touching the ground with a hesitation that spoke of long stillness rather than weakness. She swayed once, just enough to make Ethan shift forward instinctively, but she steadied herself before he could reach her, her gaze lifting to meet his again, sharper now, more focused, the violet glow behind her eyes catching what little light the sky offered. There was no gratitude there, no immediate trust, only awareness, and something else beneath it, something quieter, something that had not been erased despite everything else that had been taken from her. "Okay," Ethan murmured, more to himself than to her, as he pulled his jacket open and draped it gently around her shoulders, the fabric oversized against her small frame, the warmth already beginning to spread as the thermal lining activated, a soft hum barely audible between them. She flinched at the contact, just a fraction, but she did not pull away, and that was enough. The warning on his wrist display shifted again, the amber text replaced by a sharper, more urgent tone, beacon signal confirmed. Enforcement response inbound. Estimated arrival, 12 minutes, and Ethan exhaled slowly through his nose, his eyes flicking once toward the horizon where the storm continued to move in slow, deliberate waves, because 12 minutes out here was not a lot of time, not when something with the authority to enforce a law like this was on its way. "We should not stay," he said, glancing back at her, and this time the translator carried a slight urgency, not fear, but something close to it, enough to communicate that standing still was no longer an option. She followed his gaze briefly, then looked back at him, her head tilting slightly as if processing not just the words but the intention behind them, and then, without hesitation, she took a single step forward, closing the small distance between them on her own terms. Ethan did not smile, did not react outwardly, but something in his chest eased just enough to notice as he turned, guiding her with a subtle gesture toward the ship waiting in the distance, its silhouette barely visible through the drifting haze. The wind returned the moment they stepped beyond the column's silent boundary, sharp and immediate, biting at exposed skin, tugging at the jacket around her shoulders, and Ethan adjusted his pace automatically, positioning himself slightly ahead, not to lead, not to command, but to take the worst of the storm as they moved, his boots finding steady ground across the fractured surface, counting distance without thinking. Each step bringing them closer to the transport and farther from the place that had been designed to erase her. Behind them, the column's glow intensified briefly, the amber symbols flaring once before dimming completely, as if marking the exact moment the system lost what it had been built to contain, and somewhere far above the clouds, unseen but already on its way, something had taken notice. Ethan did not look back. The wind fought them every step of the way, sharp and relentless, dragging fine shards of dust across Ethan's visor as the transport slowly grew larger through the haze, its worn hull catching faint flashes of pale light with each shift in the storm, and behind his steady breathing he could hear the faint, uneven rhythm of smaller footsteps trying to match his pace, not quite keeping up, not falling behind either, just there, present, determined in a way that felt far older than the body it came from. He slowed slightly without turning, adjusting his stride to something she could hold, because speed did not matter if it left her behind, and somewhere in the back of his mind the countdown continued, 12 minutes shrinking with every second, the system ticking away in precise intervals that did not care about terrain, or weather, or the distance between right and wrong. The ship's external lights flickered as he keyed the remote access, the ramp lowering with a low mechanical hiss that cut through the wind just enough to sound like relief, and Ethan guided her toward it with a small motion of his hand, keeping his movements simple, readable, nothing sudden, nothing that could be mistaken for control. She hesitated at the base of the ramp, her gaze lifting to take in the structure, the lines of the ship, the open entryway, everything unfamiliar, everything uncertain, and for a moment she did not move, her fingers tightening slightly against the fabric of the jacket around her shoulders as if weighing something deeper than fear. Ethan stepped onto the ramp first, the metal surface vibrating faintly under his boots as the ship adjusted its balance, and he turned just enough to look back at her, not calling out, not urging, just waiting, offering the space for her to decide again. The wind surged once, stronger, pushing against her small frame, and that was enough. She moved, one careful step, then another, crossing the threshold not because she was told to, but because staying outside was no longer an option she could accept. Inside, the air shifted immediately, warmer, controlled, the hum of the life support system steady and familiar, and Ethan moved quickly now, sealing the ramp behind them, the outer world cutting off with a solid thud that left only the low mechanical heartbeat of the ship filling the space. "You are safe here," he said, the words coming out quieter than intended, the translator smoothing them into something gentle, something the system believed would be reassuring, and she stood just inside the cargo hold, her eyes moving across the interior, tracking every detail, every sound, every subtle shift in lighting as if mapping it all in real time. He moved past her toward the control panel, fingers already working through the startup sequence, the engines responding with a gradual rise in pitch, systems coming online one by one, navigation, shielding, comms, each indicator lighting up in a sequence he had memorized long ago, and then the warning returned, sharper now, overlaying the display in bold, uncompromising text, enforcement vessel entering atmosphere. Intercept trajectory calculated. Ethan's jaw tightened as he glanced at the coordinates, the projected path cutting directly across his current position, not searching, not guessing, coming straight for him. "Yeah," he murmured under his breath, "figures you would not send something slow," and he pushed the engines harder than he normally would, the ship responding with a strained vibration that ran through the deck beneath his feet. Behind him, there was a soft sound, not quite a step, not quite a shift, and he turned just enough to see her standing closer than before, the oversized jacket slipping slightly from one shoulder, her small hand resting lightly against the side of a storage crate as if grounding herself in something solid, her eyes fixed not on the ship, not on the controls, but on him. There was no panic there, no visible fear, only a quiet focus, as if she understood that whatever came next would be decided in this moment, and for reasons he could not fully explain, that steadiness mattered more than anything the instruments were telling him. The engines climbed in pitch, the hull vibrating as the transport lifted from the fractured surface, the storm swallowing the view almost instantly as they rose, and somewhere beyond the clouds, something far larger was already adjusting its course. Ethan did not look at the countdown anymore. He did not need to. The transport broke through the upper layer of the storm with a sudden jolt, the turbulence easing just enough for the instruments to stabilize, though the sky beyond offered no comfort, only a wide expanse of muted gray stretching into the curvature of the planet, the horizon faint and distant, and directly ahead, a blinking marker on Ethan's display that had not been there seconds ago, sharp, precise, and closing fast. The enforcement vessel did not appear immediately, but its presence was already shaping the space around it, subtle distortions in the sensor readings, a faint interference that crept into the comm channels like static with intent, and Ethan adjusted his trajectory instinctively, angling the ship toward a higher ascent, not to outrun, because he knew better than that, but to buy time. Even a few seconds mattered when the alternative was none. The engine strained under the increased output, a low vibration running through the frame as the ship climbed, and Ethan's hands moved across the controls with practiced precision, rerouting power, balancing heat, pushing the limits without crossing the line that would shut him down entirely. "We are going to move a little faster," he said, not looking back, trusting the translator to carry the tone rather than the words, steady, controlled, because panic did not belong here, not now. Behind him, there was no answer, but there was movement, soft and careful, the faint sound of fabric shifting, and when he glanced briefly over his shoulder, he saw her seated now against the side wall, the jacket pulled close around her, her small form still but alert, those violet eyes tracking the subtle shifts in the cockpit lights as if they told a story she was trying to understand. The display flashed again, a new message overlaying the navigation grid, unregistered vessel, reduce speed and prepare for compliance inspection, the text appearing in multiple languages, each one crisp, official, absolute, and Ethan let out a quiet breath through his nose, his gaze fixed forward. "Yeah," he said under his breath, "that is not happening," and he reached up, toggling the comms to manual, cutting the automatic response loop before it could acknowledge the hail, because once you answered, you were part of their system, and right now, staying outside of it was the only advantage he had. The interference grew stronger, the static now a constant presence at the edge of every system, and then it appeared, not with a dramatic entrance, not with force, but with certainty, a dark silhouette emerging from the cloud layer ahead, its shape angular and deliberate, too large for anything civilian, its surface absorbing light rather than reflecting it, as if designed to be seen only when it chose to be. Ethan adjusted course again, a slight deviation, testing, watching how quickly it mirrored the movement, and the answer came almost instantly, the marker shifting in perfect alignment, not chasing, not reacting, but predicting. "Of course you do," he muttered, fingers tightening slightly on the controls as he scanned for options that did not involve stopping, because stopping was the one thing he could not allow. The ship's systems flickered briefly as another signal pushed through the interference, stronger this time, bypassing standard channels, projecting directly onto his main display, and the message was simpler now, stripped of formality, stripped of distance. "You are in violation of imperial law," the words steady, unyielding, and beneath them, a single line that carried more weight than the rest: "Return the child." Ethan did not respond, not with words, not with action that could be read as agreement. He only adjusted the throttle, pushing the engines just a little harder, feeling the strain in the way the ship answered, the slight delay, the increased heat warning flickering at the edge of his vision, because he knew exactly what they were asking, and he knew exactly what his answer was, even if he never said it out loud. Behind him, the child shifted again, a small movement, almost imperceptible, and then a quiet sound, not a word, not fully formed, just a soft breath that carried something close to recognition, and Ethan glanced back for a fraction of a second, just long enough to see her watching the display, watching the message that had appeared, her expression unreadable but focused, as if she understood more than she should have, more than anyone had expected her to. The distance between the two vessels closed by another fraction of a mile, the numbers ticking down in steady increments, and for the first time since leaving the surface, Ethan allowed himself a single, quiet thought, not about escape, not about odds, but about what came next if he did not stop, because this was no longer just a warning, and somewhere ahead of him, beyond the reach of his sensors, beyond the limits of what his ship could outrun, the law he had chosen to break was already preparing to answer him. The ship did not shake, it did not rattle, it simply slowed, not by Ethan's command but by something external pressing against it with quiet authority, a subtle drag that no engine adjustment could compensate for, and the indicators confirmed what his instincts had already accepted, velocity dropping by measurable increments despite full thrust, the system compensating, recalculating, failing to override whatever field had been placed around him. Ethan's grip tightened on the controls, not in panic, but in recognition, because this was not a chase anymore, it was containment, precise and deliberate, the kind of response reserved for situations that were never meant to escalate this far. "They are not asking anymore," he said quietly, the words more observation than statement, and he eased off the throttle just enough to prevent the engines from overloading, because fighting something he could not see with brute force would only end one way, and he needed the ship functional for whatever came next. The enforcement vessel did not close the distance in a rush, it simply appeared closer with each passing second, its dark form now filling a larger portion of the forward view, edges sharp against the muted sky, and then a second signal cut through the interference, stronger, clearer, bypassing every filter as if it had the right to be heard. The display shifted, not with text this time, but with presence, a single figure forming in the center of the console, projected in clean, precise detail, tall, composed, her posture straight with a kind of stillness that did not need to assert control because it already had it. Her skin carried a deep, luminous tone, somewhere between blue and violet, her eyes steady, focused, not searching but seeing, and when she spoke, her voice did not carry static, did not distort, it arrived exactly as intended, calm, measured, absolute. "You have traveled far enough," she said, and the translator did not need to adjust, the meaning already clear in the cadence alone. Ethan did not answer immediately, his gaze fixed on the projection, studying not just the words but the way she held them, the way the silence between them seemed intentional rather than empty. "I was not planning to stop," he replied after a moment, his tone even, not confrontational, not submissive, simply honest, because anything else would have been a lie neither of them needed. There was no visible reaction from the figure, no shift in posture, no change in expression, only a slight narrowing of focus, as if recalibrating something internal. "You are in possession of a classified entity," she continued, the words precise, each one placed exactly where it needed to be, one that exists outside the parameters of imperial law. Ethan exhaled slowly, his eyes flicking briefly toward the child behind him before returning to the projection. She exists, he said, and that was all, because adding anything else would have weakened the statement, would have turned it into argument instead of fact. The silence that followed was different, heavier, not because of tension, but because something had shifted in the space between them, something small but undeniable. Behind him, there was movement again, the faint sound of fabric as the child shifted closer, and then something new, something unexpected, a small hand resting lightly against the back of his seat, not gripping, not clinging, just there, a point of contact that grounded her in a way the ship itself could not. Ethan did not turn, but he felt it, the subtle pressure, the warmth through the worn material, and for a brief second, everything else faded to the edges, the ship, the vessel outside, the projection in front of him, all of it secondary to the simple fact that she had chosen to reach out. The figure on the display noticed, not the gesture itself, but the change it created, her gaze shifting just slightly, not toward the child, but toward Ethan, as if reassessing the variable he represented. "You understand the consequence of your actions," she said, and this time it was not a warning, not a threat, but a statement of shared awareness. Ethan nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible motion. "Yeah," he said quietly, "I do," and for the first time since the signal had appeared, since the vessel had closed in, since the law had made itself known, his voice carried something different, not defiance, not fear, but certainty, the kind that does not come from knowing the outcome, but from accepting it. The ship remained held in place, suspended between motion and stillness, and outside, the enforcement vessel waited, not advancing, not retreating, simply there, as if the next move no longer belonged to it. The silence inside the ship stretched just long enough to feel deliberate, not empty but weighted, as if every system, every breath, every small movement had slowed to match the gravity of the moment, and Ethan kept his eyes forward, not out of defiance but because looking away would have meant searching for something he already understood. The figure on the display did not flicker, did not shift, her presence as stable as the field holding his ship in place, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a different tone, not softer, not warmer, but more precise, as if the conversation had moved beyond protocol into something less defined. "You made contact with the subject before." Removing the restraint, she said, not asking, not accusing, simply stating a sequence she already knew, and Ethan gave a small nod, his attention still on the instruments, on the readouts that no longer changed because nothing here was moving unless she allowed it. "Yeah," he answered, "I did," and he did not add anything else, because there was nothing else to add that would make it sound better, or worse. There was a pause, brief but noticeable, and then her gaze shifted slightly, not toward him, not entirely, but enough to acknowledge the presence behind him without directly addressing it. And it responded, she continued, the words measured, as if each one was being placed against an internal standard, not with aggression, not with instability, but with restraint. Ethan let out a quiet breath, his fingers relaxing just slightly against the controls. "She is not what your system thinks she is," he said, and this time his voice carried a weight that had not been there before, not louder, not sharper, just more certain, because he had seen it, felt it, something no data classification could account for. The child's hand shifted again against the back of his seat, a small adjustment, but this time it lingered, her fingers curling slightly into the worn fabric as if anchoring herself to something that would not disappear, and Ethan felt it, that quiet, steady contact, not a plea, not a demand, just presence, and for reasons he could not fully explain, it mattered more than any warning that had flashed across his screen. The figure on the display watched that moment, not the gesture itself, but the effect it created, the subtle change in Ethan's posture, the way his shoulders settled, the way his voice held steady without force, and something in her expression shifted, almost imperceptibly, not enough to call emotion, but enough to register difference. "This classification exists to prevent systemic collapse," she said, her tone returning to something closer to formal authority, but the precision remained, sharper now, more focused. Entities outside defined parameters introduce variables that cannot be contained within existing law. Ethan finally turned his head slightly, just enough to look at her directly, not challenging, not yielding, simply meeting her gaze as an equal in this moment. "Or maybe," he said slowly, choosing each word with care, the system just never learned how to make space for something new, and the words settled into the silence between them, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable in their presence. There was no immediate response, no correction, no dismissal, only that same measured stillness as she processed what had been said, not as defiance, but as data she had not accounted for. Behind Ethan, the child shifted again, her small hand leaving the seat for a brief second before returning, this time resting closer, near his shoulder, the distance between them reduced without hesitation, without fear, as if the choice had already been made somewhere deeper than thought. The field around the ship pulsed once, subtle but noticeable, the instruments flickering as if reacting to a change in parameters that had not been input through any system Ethan could access, and for the first time since the encounter began, the enforcement vessel did not feel like a barrier, it felt like something waiting. The figure's gaze remained steady, but the silence that followed was no longer empty of direction, it was moving towards something, a decision forming not through command, but through recognition, and Ethan held that space without pushing, without retreating, because whatever came next would not be decided by force, it would be decided by something far less predictable. The shift came quietly, not with a command, not with a visible override, but with absence, the pressure holding the ship in place easing by a fraction so small the instruments barely registered it at first, a subtle drift returning to the navigation grid, a freedom that felt less like release and more like permission, and Ethan did not move immediately, his hands still resting on the controls, waiting. Because rushing a moment like this would turn it into something else, something forced. Something that did not belong to him. The figure on the display remained, her posture unchanged, her gaze steady, but there was something different now. Something beneath the precision of her composure, a recalibration that had nothing to do with systems and everything to do with choice. "You believe this entity should be exempt," she said, and this time it was not framed as a violation, not structured as law, but as a question without asking it directly, a space opened where there had not been one before. Ethan shook his head slightly, his eyes still forward. "No," he said quietly, "I believe she should not have been condemned in the first place," and the words settled into the air with a weight that did not need emphasis, because they were not meant to convince, they were meant to exist. Behind him, the child's hand tightened briefly against his shoulder, a small reaction, not to the words themselves, but to the shift in tone, the way the moment had changed without sound, and Ethan could feel it, that subtle pressure, that silent acknowledgement that something important was happening even if she could not name it. The figure's eyes moved then, not sharply, not suddenly, but with intent, her focus shifting past Ethan for the first time, settling on the space where the child stood, not as a target, not as an object, but as something to be understood, and the silence that followed was longer now, deeper, as if time itself had slowed to accommodate the weight of what she was seeing. "This classification was created to preserve stability," she said after a moment, her voice lower, not in volume but in distance, as if she were speaking from somewhere beyond the immediate situation, to ensure that variables beyond control did not alter the foundation of the empire, and for the first time, there was a hint of something beneath the words, not doubt, not uncertainty, but awareness. The kind that comes when a system encounters something it was never designed to process. Ethan did not interrupt, did not respond immediately, because this was no longer about argument, it was about recognition, and forcing it would only push it away. The child shifted again, stepping closer, the oversized jacket slipping slightly as she moved, and then, slowly, deliberately, she reached forward, her small hand extending past Ethan's shoulder, not toward him, but toward the projection, toward the figure that existed only as light and signal, her fingers stopping just short of the display as if she understood, instinctively, that this was not something she could physically touch. The gesture was simple, almost fragile, but it carried a clarity that no data could replicate, no classification could contain, and Ethan saw it in the way the figure's gaze changed, just slightly, the precision softening at the edges, not losing control, but adjusting to something that did not require it. The field around the ship pulsed again, stronger this time, the instruments flickering as if responding to a command that had not been spoken aloud, and then, slowly, deliberately, the containment released, not abruptly, not with force, but with intention, the invisible hold dissolving into nothing as the ship regained full control of its movement. Ethan's hands tightened on the controls for a brief second, instinctively ready to act, but he did not accelerate, did not change course, he simply held position, waiting, because leaving now without acknowledgement would reduce this moment to escape, and that was not what this was. The figure remained on the display, her gaze returning to Ethan, steady, composed, but no longer entirely bound by the structure that had defined her before. "There are consequences," she said, and the words were true, unchanged, but the way she said them carried something new, something that existed alongside the law rather than beneath it. "Not all of them are written," and for the first time since this encounter began, the statement did not feel like a warning, it felt like an opening. Ethan gave a small nod, not in agreement, not in submission, but in understanding, because whatever came next would not be defined by what had already been decided, it would be shaped by what had just changed, and for the first time since he saw that signal on his scanner, he allowed himself a single, quiet realization, that this was no longer about running, and it was no longer about being caught. It was about what someone in power chose to do when faced with something they could not explain. For a long moment, nothing moved, not the ship, not the distant vessel, not even the thin layer of clouds drifting far below them, and Ethan kept his hand steady on the controls, not out of tension but out of respect for the silence that had settled between them, because it no longer felt like waiting for a command, it felt like witnessing a decision. The figure on the display remained, her presence still precise, still composed, but something had shifted in the way she held that composure, as if the structure behind it had been quietly rewritten, not erased, not broken, but expanded to include something it had never accounted for before. "The law exists to define what must be done," she said, her voice calm, measured, but no longer distant, as if the words carried a weight she was actively choosing to bear, "but it does not always define what should be done," and the distinction settled into the space between them with a clarity that required no explanation. Ethan did not respond immediately, his gaze steady, his posture unchanged, because he understood what she was saying without needing to hear more, and more importantly, he understood what it cost her to say it. Behind him, the child's hand remained near his shoulder, no longer tentative, no longer testing, just there, a quiet, steady presence that did not demand attention but anchored it, and when Ethan finally glanced back, just briefly, he saw her watching the projection, her expression still unreadable, but her eyes reflecting something new, not fear, not confusion, but recognition, as if she understood that whatever had held her before no longer did. The figure's gaze shifted once more, not sharply, not with urgency, but with intent, and for the first time, there was something almost personal in the way she looked at the child, not as a variable, not as an anomaly, but as something that existed beyond classification. "This entity will no longer be pursued under imperial directive," she stated, and the words carried the weight of law even as they redefined it, precise, irrevocable. "All enforcement protocols regarding this classification are hereby suspended," and though the tone remained steady, the implication was not small, it was not procedural, it was foundational. Ethan exhaled slowly, a breath he had not realized he had been holding, and his grip on the controls eased just slightly, not in relief, but in acknowledgement of what had just been altered. "That is going to cause problems," he said quietly, not as a challenge, not as a warning, but as a simple truth, because systems did not shift without consequence, and he knew she knew that. The figure did not look away. "Yes," she replied, and there was no hesitation, no attempt to soften it, only acceptance, "but some problems exist because they have been avoided for too long," and for the first time, there was something unmistakably human in the way she said it, not in form, not in biology, but in choice. The projection flickered once, not as a failure, but as a transition, and the final words came without embellishment, without ceremony, "You are free to go," and then she was gone, the display returning to its normal interface as if nothing had occupied it moments before. The enforcement vessel remained in view for a few seconds longer, its dark silhouette holding position against the pale sky, and then, slowly, deliberately, it turned, not abruptly, not dramatically, just a gradual shift in orientation before it moved away, disappearing back into the upper atmosphere with the same quiet certainty it had arrived with. The space around Ethan's ship felt different now, not because anything had physically changed, but because something unseen had been lifted, something that had defined the boundaries of this moment without ever being visible. He did not accelerate immediately, did not change course, he simply sat there for a second longer, letting the quiet settle into something real, something lasting. Behind him, There was a small movement, and then a soft voice, barely above a whisper, the first true word she had spoken, not translated, not processed, but understood anyway. "Home," she said, and Ethan closed his eyes for just a brief second before opening them again, his hands moving back across the controls as the ship responded, engines rising into a steady hum, not forced, not strained, just enough. He guided the transport forward, not toward escape, not away from danger, but into open space, where nothing had been decided yet, where nothing needed to be. And somewhere far behind them, in a place built on rules and order, a single decision lingered, quiet but permanent, because the law had not been broken by force, it had been rewritten by understanding, and for the first time, it had made room for something it could not control, only accept.